In the last lesson, we started looking at jQuery, a powerful JavaScript library that lets us select elements from the DOM, modify them, and add event listeners, which are callback functions that are invoked when the user interacts with them. In this lesson, we'll look a little more at the jQuery syntax for doing things like selecting elements of the DOM, but we'll start with some of the shortcuts that we can use to add event listeners. In this example, we'll see the names of some animals in an unordered list. And when I move the mouse over an element in the list, that element name will turn red and will get slightly bigger. When I move to another element in the list, that item will get red and bigger, and the original item that I had been over will go back to normal. So let's see how we accomplish that. First, as in all of these examples, keep in mind that you need to include the jQuery library. jQuery is not part of JavaScript by default, but rather we need to include that as a script in our header. In the body of the HTML, I have an unordered list and the list items with the names of the animals. Now in my JavaScript, I'll use a jQuery selector to select all of the list items. For all of the list items, I will set a callback function for the mouse enter event. The mouse enter event is where the user moves the mouse over or enters that particular item. The callback function will be this function here, which is going to use a jQuery selector to select this list item, because we don't want this to apply for all list items, but rather the one that the user entered the mouse over. And we'll use the CSS function to set the CSS properties. In this case, we're setting the color to red. On the next line, we'll apply another CSS property. This will be setting the font size to 120%. Then below that, we have mouse leave. Mouse leave is where the user moves the mouse away from the item. And here we're setting another function, which will set the color to black and the font size back to 100% when the user moves the mouse away from this item. This combination of mouse enter and mouse leave is common enough that in jQuery there's a shortcut for it, which is hover. Hover is the event where the user moves the mouse over an item and then moves it away. Hover allows you to specify two functions. The first is the mouse enter function. That's this one here. This is the function that will be called when the user first starts hovering over the item. The second function down here is the mouse leave function. This is where the user stops hovering over the item and moves the mouse away from it. In this example, we see how we can combine multiple callback functions together into a single object using the on event. The on event allows us to bind multiple callback functions to a single selected item by specifying an object that lists all of the different functions for the different events. So here we see that the object that we're passing to on lets us specify a function for mouse enter, a function for mouse leave, and also a function for click, that is when the user clicks that item. In this example, now we see the list of animal names. As we saw previously, when I hover over elephant or bear, they would turn red and get bigger. But now I also want some list items, for instance, canary and eagle at the bottom, where when I hover over them, they don't change. Well, in the jQuery that we had before, we were specifying the functionality for all list items. Now let's see how we can do that for only some of them. So here's the code that will let us accomplish that. And one approach is to add these list items to a class. For instance, I've called it highlight, that lets us say these elements should be highlighted when the mouse hovers over them. On the other hand, these elements down here, canary and eagle, are not in the highlight class, and so therefore they will not be highlighted when I hover over them. How do I differentiate between them and specify that the highlight class elements should be highlighted and the others shouldn't be? I use this selector notation down here, where I indicate that for the list items, I only want to apply this to elements in the highlight class. Remember, the dot and then the name of the class name allows us to select a class, as in CSS, and what we're doing now is only applying this functionality, the on event, to list items that are in the highlight class. This is a good solution, but it meant that for every list item I kept having to copy and paste class equals highlight, and so on. So a perhaps nicer, shorter solution is to put the entire unordered list into this class called highlight, whereas this unordered list is not in that class. But now how do I bind the events to the specific list items that are in that unordered list in that class? I'll start with the same selector notation that we just saw. Here I'm selecting all of the unordered lists in this highlight class, but I don't want to bind events to the unordered list. I want to bind events to the list items. Therefore, I need to use the find list item function and apply it to the value that was returned by that selector. So a way to think of it is I'm finding the list items that are in this class in these types of HTML elements. Now again, I can use the on event and specify the mouse enter, mouse leave, and even click functions for the list items that are in the unordered list that's in the highlight class. Let's go over some of the advanced selectors. We've seen selecting elements by their HTML element type. We've seen selecting by their class or by ID. And in this previous example, we've seen using the find function to search for the node's children, given some selector. We've also seen how we can chain the selectors. We can, for instance, select all divs that are in a specific class, or we can select divs and elements that are in a specific class using this notation here. I can use the colon notation to specify elements that have a specific property. For instance, down here, I'll select all the P elements, the paragraph elements that have the hidden property. We'll see that in a future example. Last, it's worth pointing out that all of these are CSS selectors. All of the CSS selectors that we've seen before will still work in jQuery with the $sign notation. In summary, we've seen how we can use jQuery to select items, modify them, and add event listeners. We have shortcuts for adding multiple event listeners and more complex ways of selecting elements. In the next lesson, we'll see how we can put those all together to create more complex applications.